Right, so when Abdel Fattah el-Sisi insists that Egypt's side of Rafah is open, you almost have to admire the audacity, don't you? Open to what exactly? Not to flour, not to medicine, not to sacks of rice or bottled water. Those aid trucks sit idle in Al-Arish, baking under the Sinai sun. Their drivers abandoned to the fiction that the gate will one day swing open. But open to commerce with Israel? That door never creaks shut, does it? Cement ships have sailed, container vessels have departed, goods are exchanged with clockwork regularity there. It's a grotesque inversion. The crossing that should be Gaza's lifeline is a theatre of excuses instead, while the ports that could be paused in protest are buzzing with business. Recep Tayyip Erdogan performs the same charade with his own flair. On stage he bellows that Israel is a terrorist state, worse than Hitler, as Istanbul crowds cheer his defiance. Off stage, his tankers quietly slip out of Ceyhan, carrying the crude that powers Israeli tanks and fighter jets. Turkish export statistics tell the tale. Billions in machinery, cement and textiles keep flowing, even as Erdogan insists his government has cut Israel off. The duplicity is so brazen it feels almost choreographed, denounced by day, deal by night. Between them, Egypt and Turkey have perfected a grotesque double act. They pound the table in solidarity with Palestine, but sign off on Israel's trade lifelines. They posture as champions of Gaza while enabling the siege that starves it. Their speeches draw applause, their policies draw profit, and Gaza, as always, draws the short straw. Right, so in the annals of modern Middle Eastern politics, few images capture the dissonance between rhetoric and reality as vividly as the scenes from Rafah. On the Egyptian side of the border crossing, convoys of trucks carrying humanitarian relief for Gaza lie idle, their cargoes of flour, medicine, bottled water rotting or expiring in warehouses and roadside queues. Sacks of flour spoil, medical supplies expire, bottled water sits under a punishing desert sun. Drivers wait, aid workers despair, and families across the border starve. The visual could not be more striking. Lifelines deliberately severed, salvation stalled at the threshold. And yet in the very same week that these trucks are turned back, commercial shipping routes between Egyptian and Turkish ports and Israel's Haifa and Ashdod remain wide open. Container ships and cement carriers, vehicle transporters and bulk cargo vessels glide freely across the Mediterranean. They arrive at Israeli docks, unload, reload and sail again. Cement flows, chemicals move, fruits and preserved foods are delivered. Israeli markets remain supplied, its war economy continues to function, its siege of Gaza faces no material disruption at all. Egypt and Turkey present themselves as defenders of the Palestinian cause, voices of indignation against Israel's war on Gaza, leaders of Muslim solidarity in the face of brutality. Egypt insists it cannot be complicit in strangling Gaza, while Turkey's president calls Israel a terrorist state and worse than Hitler. And yet the practical policies of both governments tell another story. Egypt maintains the closure of Rafah while enabling commercial trade with Israel through its ports. Turkey supplies nearly half of Israel's oil through the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline and sustains billions of dollars of bilateral trade despite public proclamations of embargo. When aid convoys are blocked but commercial ships sail, whose side are Egypt and Turkey really on here? Surely it's not a difficult question to answer. Well, the Rafah crossing has always been more than a simple border point, hasn't it? It's symbolised the lifeline between Gaza and the outside world, the artery through which food, medicine and human connection could pass. Since October of 2023, when Israel launched its most devastating campaign against Gaza, Rafah has carried an even greater symbolic and practical weight. With the Kerem Shalom and Eretz crossings occupied by Israeli forces, Rafah was the last possible opening for relief into Gaza, the only route that didn't rely on Israel, the only route they didn't control. Yet for much of this war it has remained closed or functionally obstructed. Reuters reported this past week that aid convoys destined for Gaza languished in Egyptian warehouses or along roadside queues near Al-Arish, waiting indefinitely for clearance that never comes. Cairo's official position, perversely, has been that Egypt's side of the crossing's open. It's open. What are you talking about? We haven't shut it. And that Israel is the party preventing aid from passing into Gaza. But it wasn't Israel that stopped the Samad aid convoy from getting there, though, was it? But then even with that point aside, this rhetorical sleight of hand collapses under scrutiny. Egypt controls its territory, absolutely. If Cairo genuinely wished to force the issue, it could do so. It could escort the convoys to the border, invite international monitors to document Israel's obstruction, and make a formal case before the international community. Instead, Egypt does nothing. Sisi does nothing. The numbers underline the duplicity. Middle East Eye has reported that Egyptian ports such as Al-Arish, Damietta, Abu Qir and Port Said have become vital supply points for Israel during the war. Saba news agency using satellite tracking provides the raw figures. In the second week of this month alone, there were 72 commercial voyages between Egyptian and Turkish ports and Israel. In the first week of August, there were 92. Since the start of the war in October 2023, there have been 2,264 voyages in total, of which 1,475 were directly linked to Egypt. Egypt's foreign minister insists that Cairo cannot be blamed since Israel blocks the Gazan side of Rafah. But this is cowardice disguised as diplomacy. Cairo is unwilling to risk confrontation with Israel or its backers, unwilling to jeopardize the $1.3 billion it receives annually in US military aid, unwilling to alienate Gulf financiers or to destabilize its fragile economy. And so it allows Israel to usurp sovereignty over Rafah and uses the convenient excuse of helplessness to justify inaction. The cost is not merely reputational. Every blocked convoy translates into lives lost. Every rotting sack of flour into a family's hunger. Cause and effect are direct. Egypt's cowardice prolongs Gaza's famine. To understand the full weight of Egypt's betrayal, it's worth reflecting for a moment on the 1979 Camp David Accords and the subsequent Egypt-Israel peace treaty. These agreements were built on the premise of mutual recognition, territorial integrity and sovereignty. Egypt regained Sinai in exchange for demilitarization and a promise of peaceful relations. Israel, in turn, pledged to respect Egypt's territorial authority. Today, Israel exercises de facto control over Rafah, dictating which convoys pass and which are blocked, bombing the Gazan side at will and enforcing its own veto over humanitarian access. This is, in effect, a violation of Egyptian sovereignty and a breach of the spirit of Camp David. And yet Egypt makes no formal protest. The reason is painfully obvious for that, sadly. Egypt's regime has staked its survival on preserving the relationship established at Camp David instead of defending its own sovereignty. US military aid, the backbone of Egypt's armed forces, flows as long as that treaty holds. Intelligence sharing with Israel in Sinai is essential to Cairo's security doctrine as well. Economic bailouts from the IMF and Gulf monarchies are contingent on US approval. To challenge Israel at Rafah would risk all of these lifelines. Thus, Cairo accepts humiliation and betrays Gaza, choosing dependency over dignity and survival over solidarity. By allowing Israel to hollow out the Camp David framework with impunity, Egypt is weakening its own sovereignty in the long term. If Tel Aviv can dictate what crosses Rafah today, what will stop it from dictating broader terms of Egyptian policy tomorrow? Cowardice in the present sets the stage for subservience in the future. If Egypt's betrayal is rooted in cowardice, though, Turkey's is rooted in duplicity. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has spent the past 2 years positioning himself as Gaza's loudest defender. He has called Israel a terrorist state. He has denounced Benjamin Netanyahu as worse than Hitler and encouraged massive pro-Palestinian demonstrations across Turkey. State media has relentlessly broadcast images of Israeli atrocities, cultivating an image of Turkey as the moral leader of the Muslim world. And yet the infrastructure of energy and trade tells another story. Israel receives roughly 40% of its crude oil via the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which terminates at the Turkish port of Ceyhan. Tankers load crude and sail directly to Ashkelon and Haifa. Throughout the war, this flow has not ceased for a single day. Turkish ports remain lifelines for Israel's energy security. The trade figures are equally damning. Despite publicly announcing a suspension of exports in May of 2024, Turkey was still Israel's fifth largest exporter by the end of that year, with nearly $3 billion in trade. Machinery, steel, cement, textiles, vehicles continued to flow. It was reported in November of last year that Ankara had asked export groups to snuff out leaks in the supposed ban, tacitly acknowledging that trade persisted. And this month, Saba confirmed through satellite data that Turkish ports such as Iskenderun, Nemrut and Mersin continued to send ships carrying containers and vehicles to Israel. And here too the contradiction is staggering. Erdogan thunders against Israel in public, while supplying it with oil and goods in private. One particularly vivid example occurred back in May when Erdogan addressed a rally in Istanbul, denounced Israel as a terrorist state, while on that same day, tanker tracking showed crude leaving Ceyhan for Ashkelon. These two images, Erdogan's raised fist in Istanbul and the tanker sailing calmly from Turkey to Israel, are the perfect example of Turkish duplicity. Erdogan's rhetoric plays to domestic and regional audiences, bolstering his Islamist credentials and projecting Turkey as a defender of Palestine, but it is a lie. The reality is that Turkey, like Egypt, sustains Israel's economy while Gaza withers, and the consequences are not limited to Gaza alone. By maintaining this double game, Ankara risks discrediting its broader foreign policy and undermining its own claims to moral leadership in the Muslim world. The consequences of this duplicity reverberate beyond Gaza, though. They ripple through Egyptian and Turkish societies, where their respective publics overwhelmingly support Palestine and increasingly see through the lies of their leaders. In Cairo, protests have erupted outside the journalist syndicate, denouncing Sisi's cowardice. Social media brims with anger that Egypt blocks trucks of flour while facilitating ships of cement. In Istanbul, pro-Palestinian demonstrators increasingly accuse Erdogan of hypocrisy, of playing a double game that enriches Turkey while Gaza suffers. Arab public opinion has long been staunchly pro-Palestinian. The gap between this sentiment and the actions of regimes grows wider each day. Egypt and Turkey may hope to manage this through rhetoric and theatrics, but resentment builds, and this resentment carries consequences. A regime that betrays Palestine risks delegitimizing itself at home. Betrayal of Gaza is not only a crime against Palestinians, it is a gamble with domestic stability. And the legal dimension of all of this is equally damning. International humanitarian law prohibits the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. Blocking humanitarian convoys while sustaining the economy of the besieging power could amount to aiding and abetting such a crime. Egypt and Turkey are not passive observers here. They are active participants in a system that starves Gaza. Could international courts hold them accountable? Realistically, the political structures of the ICC and ICJ make prosecution unlikely, but the principle remains. Under the law, complicity is complicity, whether or not it is punished, and the reputational damage is still very real. In international forums, in the court of history, Egypt and Turkey's duplicity will be remembered. Unless they change course, they may cement their legacy as collaborators in Gaza's siege, not as champions of its survival at all. Egypt's insistence that its side of Rafah is open is cowardice in diplomatic costume. Turkey's denunciations of Israel are theatre masking pipelines and trade. Both states betray Gaza through their actions while claiming to defend it with words. The facts speak for themselves. Aid convoys are blocked, Rafah remains closed, but ships sail. Cement flows, oil pumps, trade continues. The numbers strip away all pretense. 72 voyages in 1 week, 92 in another, 2,264 in total since October 2023. $1.3 billion in US military aid to Egypt. 40% of Israel's oil from Ceyhan. Nearly $3 billion in Turkish exports. These are not allegations, they are data points. The larger stakes are equally undeniable. By collaborating with Israel's war economy while Gaza starves, Egypt and Turkey are not only betraying Palestinians, they are weakening regional solidarity, emboldening Israel to deepen its siege, and exposing themselves to domestic unrest. Their hypocrisy fractures trust in Arab leadership, corrodes their credibility, and surrenders their leverage to Washington and Tel Aviv. The final verdict is not a closed loop but an open warning. Unless confronted by their own publics and the wider world, Sisi and Erdogan may be remembered not as defenders of Gaza, but as collaborators in its strangulation. The story is not finished, though. Its ending depends on whether their cowardice and duplicity are allowed to stand, whether they get away with it, or whether history forces them onto the side they so loudly claim they already occupy. And of course, on top of this, there is Egypt's $35 billion energy deal with Israel now, which ties their economies together for years to come. One of the largest economic trade deals Israel has ever conducted and completed, and coming right in the middle of them committing genocide against a people Egypt literally have a door to. That regardless of their claims, they are very much keeping shut. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.